I remember the moment everything changed. The road stretched ahead, rain falling hard enough to erase the lines, and the sound of my son's voice fading behind me. That silence was not just absence, it was abandonment. Trust does not break loudly, it fractures in the quiet, when the people you built your life around decide you are no longer worth the truth. What followed was not rage, but awakening, the kind that burns and rebuilds at the same time. Sometimes the cruelest betrayal comes not from strangers, but from the faces that once called you family. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Hart, and I live in a small house on the south side of Tacoma, Washington. The walls smell faintly of linseed oil and lavender. When the morning light hits the window, it finds the jars of paintbrushes lined neatly on my work table, every bristle cleaned, every tube rolled tight. After 40 years of teaching art to restless high school students, I still wake early out of habit, even though the classroom is long behind me. My husband, Mark, died 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, and the quiet that followed him has stayed in the house like a shadow that never moves. Daniel, my son, says he worries about me living alone. He visits on Sundays with his wife, Brooke. Daniel is 38, tall, always with a phone in his hand and a smile that looks borrowed from a business meeting. Brooke, 36, is the kind of woman who organizes every hour of her life and probably mine if I allowed her. She speaks in polished words about efficiency and legacy, using them as if love were a spreadsheet. When Mark died, they convinced me to sell the old family house in Gig Harbor. Brooke said it was not financially optimal to keep maintaining such a large property, and Daniel promised to manage everything through a document called a durable power of attorney so that I would never have to worry again. I trusted him without reading every line. Most days are quiet. I paint small coastal scenes and sell them at the weekend market, mostly to tourists who say the water looks peaceful. Sometimes I teach watercolor to a group of retirees at the community center. We talk about weather, color, and the strange way time speeds up after 50. At night, I watch the lights of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge and imagine Mark's truck crossing it. The memory looping until sleep finally comes, I tell myself this is peace, though it feels more like waiting. Brooke emails me every few weeks about estate alignment or income consolidation. The words sound clean but sharp, like tools for cutting rather than building. Daniel insists on handling my bills, saying it saves me the trouble of managing online accounts. My mail is redirected to his office for further record keeping. They mean well, I think, yet there are moments when I feel my life being filed under their names. I try not to dwell on it. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry when you are someone's mother. One evening, as rain whispered against the roof, Daniel called. His voice was bright. "We should take a little weekend trip, Mom," he said. "You need air. Bainbridge Island, maybe a family reset." Brooke's voice floated in the background, agreeing that salt air would be good for me. I agreed, because saying no to Daniel always feels like closing a door I do not want shut forever. I packed my sketchbook, a warm scarf that once belonged to Mark, and a small box of paints wrapped in a towel. The rain thickened as I zipped the bag. It sounded like a warning written in Morse code against the window pane. The next morning, fog hung over the sound. The ferry's horn broke the air like a deep sigh. Brooke sat beside Daniel, both staring at their phones. I watched the city fade into gray water. For a moment, our reflections floated together in the glass. 3 blurred faces, mine fading first. The sea smelled of rust and memory. Somewhere behind the fog, a gull cried, and I thought how fragile trust was, how it stretches and stretches until the smallest pull can tear it. That night, as the rain returned, I dreamt of standing on a dock, hearing someone call my name from the dark. I did not answer. I only listened, waiting to know whether the voice was meant to save me or warn me. If you're still watching and feeling the tension build, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, hold on. Things are about to take a sharp turn in Chapter 2. Rain followed us from Tacoma, as if it had decided we would not be allowed a clear day. Daniel drove in silence, his hands tight on the wheel, the muscles in his forearms twitching each time the wipers scraped. Brooke sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, murmuring about liquidity and deadlines as though she were afraid silence might turn into confession. I watched the fog rise from the highway and thought how strange it was that every trip began with the promise of return, even when the road had no such intention. The ferry ride to Bainbridge Island felt longer than usual. The air inside the car was thick and metallic. I tried to speak about the clouds, the way the horizon folded into the water, but my words went nowhere. Daniel kept his eyes forward, his profile sharp in the gray light. He used to color outside the lines on purpose when he was little, laughing each time I scolded him. Now his control frightened me. Brooke smiled at me through the rearview mirror and said, "Well, I should feel lucky to have a family who cared about my future comfort." I nodded because that was easier than asking what comfort meant. After the ferry docked, the road curved through pine and cedar. Daniel started talking about my will, how it might be time to simplify. Brooke joined in, suggesting we consolidate accounts, streamline transfers, avoid unnecessary delay if something happened. I said I was healthy, that there was no reason to rush. Brooke smiled again, thin as glass, and said, "You never know, Mom." The word "Mom" felt borrowed, like a title she had not earned. Daniel did not look at me. He only said we were taking a detour to see something. I should have asked more questions. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap and watched the rain smear the trees into green ghosts. We turned off the main road onto a narrow drive that led to a deserted overlook. The sea below was steel gray, restless. Daniel got out, phone pressed to his ear. Brooke followed, saying she needed to check reception. The doors closed softly. I waited, counting the seconds until I would hear their voices again. The rain grew heavier. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Through the fogged glass, I saw movement. A shape, headlights bending away, the sound of tires fading down the hill. I opened the door. Cold air struck my face like a slap. The SUV's taillights glowed once, then vanished into the mist. I stood in the downpour, my scarf plastered to my neck, my breath shallow. I whispered that they would come back. The words felt childish, so I said them again. No one answered. Water filled my shoes. I searched my pockets. No phone, no wallet, nothing. The world was narrowed to sound, the hiss of rain, the hum of wind, the pulse of my own disbelief. I thought of Daniel as a boy, running barefoot on the lawn, calling me mama, between bursts of laughter. That memory sank like a stone in my chest. When headlights finally appeared, I stepped back, unsure whether to hide or wave. The car slowed, a silver sedan, its beams cutting through the curtain of rain. The door opened, and a woman in a wheelchair looked out. Her hair was white, her coat soaked, her eyes sharp and alive. Get in before you freeze, she said. I hesitated. Who are you? The woman's voice was steady. Someone who knows what it feels like to be left behind. Inside the car, heat spread slowly from the vents, fogging the windows until the world outside was only motion. She studied me for a moment, then spoke again. Pretend I'm your mother. Your son will regret everything he did. I tried to answer, but my voice dissolved into the sound of the tires on wet pavement. The woman adjusted her blanket and said almost gently, Rest now. Tomorrow, we begin to fix what they broke. I stared out at the drenched forest flashing past, my reflection faint on the glass, half fear and half fragile hope, and thought, I do not yet know this woman, but she already knows me. If this story already has you questioning who can truly be trusted, comment number 2 below so I know you're still following. Next, we'll see how one choice begins to unravel everything in Chapter 3. When I woke, the air smelled of cedar and rosewater. The quilt around me was soft and heavy, stitched with tiny blue flowers that looked hand-sewn. For a long moment, I did not know where I was, then memory returned like a tide. Rain, the empty road, the red blur of taillights, and the woman in the wheelchair. My chest ached with the same disbelief that had carried me through the night. I sat up slowly, hearing the faint cry of gulls beyond the window and the rhythm of waves against a distant dock. The room was small but orderly. Lace curtains filtered pale morning light. On the dresser, a bowl of polished stones gleamed beside a wooden cross. My shoes, still damp, rested neatly on a mat near the door. Someone had cleaned them. For a second I thought of Daniel, and the way he used to leave his shoes everywhere until I taught him better. The thought stung. I pressed my hands together until they stopped shaking. A quiet knock came at the door, then the voice of the woman who had rescued me. Tea is ready. I followed the sound down a short hallway into a kitchen filled with sunlight and the smell of bread. Agnes Whitcomb sat near the window in her wheelchair, a wool shawl around her shoulders. She looked older in daylight, but also sharper, as if carved from something unbreakable. She poured tea without asking how I took it. You slept 12 hours, she said. That is good. Your body remembers what your mind is still denying. I wanted to thank her, but words caught in my throat. I finally managed. Why did you help me? Agnes's gaze did not waver. Because once, someone left me in the rain too. She told me her story in a voice that never trembled. She had owned a small art gallery in Port Townsend. Her son and his wife convinced her to sign a few documents for efficiency. Within a month, the gallery was gone, her name erased. She built her life again through something she called Harbor Lantern. Around her kitchen were photographs of women, some smiling, some solemn, each framed beside a small paper lantern. They are not victims, she said. They are reminders that fire still burns, even in old hands. When she spoke of Harbor Lantern, I listened as if to a foreign language. It was a quiet network of women who had been exploited by family or caregivers. Retired lawyers, investigators, and social workers offered help in secret, protecting dignity where the law had been too slow. I asked whether it was legal. Agnes smiled faintly. We do not steal, we restore. Part of me wanted to believe her. Another part whispered that Daniel would come back once he realized what he had done. Agnes saw that thought before I spoke it. Hope is lovely, she said, but when tied to a chain, it only circles the same pain. Her words landed gently, but I felt them bruise. I stared into my teacup and whispered that Mark would never have believed our son capable of cruelty. Agnes's reply was soft. Then you must believe it for both of you. She rolled to a small desk, drew out a file, and handed it to me. Inside were bank statements and notarized documents. My name was on them, crossed out by new signatures. Daniels and Brooks money transferred, property reassigned. My breath caught. How did you get these? Agnes only said, Harbor Lantern keeps its eyes open. The truth hollowed me, yet under the hollow came something fiercer. I looked at her and said, Then teach me how to begin. Outside, dusk had started to fall. Through the window, I saw small lanterns floating across the harbor. Their reflections trembling on the water, Agnes followed my gaze. For every woman who decides she will not disappear, she said. One lantern drifted toward shore, its light steady despite the wind. I watched it and thought, maybe the tide has finally turned for me. If you can sense that the storm is just beginning, drop number 3 in the comments to show you're still with me. Up next, Chapter 4 will reveal how desperation starts to twist every intention. Morning light fell across Agnes's kitchen table, catching the edges of old folders and steaming cups of coffee. I sat between two women I had just met, Lydia Tran, a retired attorney with the sharp eyes behind gentle glasses, and Marie Delgado, a former social worker whose voice carried both patience and warning. They were members of Harbor Lantern, the quiet network Agnes had built from women who had once been silenced and decided never to be again. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and determination. Lydia spread my documents across the table, deeds, statements, and that single sheet granting Daniel control of my accounts. She traced her finger over my signature and said that proving coercion would not be simple. They used your trust as a tool, she explained. That makes it clean on paper, dirty in truth. Shame rose in my throat. I told her I should have read everything. She shook her head. You were groomed to trust. That is not weakness. That is design. The words lingered like a small mercy. Marie handed me a notebook, asking me to write down every memory that involved Daniel and Brooks' influence, what they said, how they acted, even what they avoided saying. Memory can be evidence when paper has been stolen, she said. The three of them began to plan. I listened, trying to follow the language of affidavits, filings, and petitions. Their calm precision both comforted and frightened me. Lydia suggested drafting an affidavit of financial coercion to begin a record. Agnes poured tea, her movement slow but steady, and said, Balance, not revenge. I nodded, though I was not sure which one my heart desired. Later that afternoon, we decided I should speak to Daniel directly. Agnes handed me her landline. My hands trembled as I dialed. When he answered, his voice was clipped and polite, the tone of a man speaking to a stranger. I told him I needed to see my financial accounts. He said everything was being handled for my safety and that Brooke was keeping things in order. I asked for thumbs. He paused before saying, Mom, maybe it is time you stop worrying about money and start enjoying retirement. I heard Brooke whisper something before the line went dead. The sound of the disconnect was louder than thunder. When Lydia later filed inquiries with the county records office, her brow tightened. She turned the monitor toward me, showing a fresh submission. Daniel had filed paperwork claiming I was mentally incompetent, petitioning for full guardianship. My name sat there, reduced to a case number. For a moment, the room tilted. Agnes reached for my hand as if she had expected this. They erase you by writing you out of your own mind, she said softly. I wanted to scream, but instead I laughed, the kind of laugh that frightens even the one making it. Lydia and Marie exchanged a glance, not pitying, only resolute. They promised to counter the claim quietly, to gather affidavits from neighbors and students who could testify to my lucidity. That night, I walked alone to the harbor. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke. Lanterns drifted on the water, their reflections trembling like fragile stars. I thought about trust, how easily it could be turned into a weapon. My reflection on the surface looked like a ghost learning to breathe again, Somewhere behind me, a gull cried, and I realized that grief had changed its shape. It was no longer soft or helpless. It was something alive. When I returned, Agnes waited by the window. She said the next step would take us to Seattle, to the firm Brooke managed. I nodded. For the first time in months, I told her, I feel something moving beneath my ribs. Not fear, not sorrow, but the faint pulse of anger finding its purpose. If you're feeling the weight of every secret building, comment number 4 below to stay on this journey with me. The next chapter is where confrontation becomes impossible to avoid. The morning air carried the scent of salt and fuel as we waited for the ferry to Seattle. The sky was a hard, pale gray, and the water below looked as if it could swallow anything unsteady. Agnes sat beside me, wrapped in a wool coat, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Lydia and Marie spoke quietly behind us, reviewing notes and case files. I held my sketchbook on my lap but did not draw. The last time I crossed this water, I had been led into silence. Now, I crossed by choice. The sea was the same, yet everything else had changed. When the ferry docked, the city rose like glass and steel stacked on old bones. I had not been to Seattle in years. Mark and I once came here to celebrate Daniel's first job offer. That memory now felt borrowed, belonging to someone else. As the car carried us through the morning traffic, I watched the skyline reflect in the windows of office towers. So many mirrors, all showing versions of people who looked in control. Brooke's firm, Whitfield Financial Consulting, stood beside Lake Union. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and expensive perfume. The receptionist's smile faltered when Agnes gave her name. Within minutes, Brooke appeared, her heels sharp against the tile. She greeted me with that polished tone she used for clients, not family. I asked to see my financial records. She said Daniel had already taken care of everything, that I should not worry. Her voice was smooth, but her eyes were calculating. Lydia introduced herself as my legal counsel and handed over the affidavit of financial coercion. Brooke's face stiffened. The silence that followed pressed against the glass walls. Before we could leave, the elevator opened, and Daniel stepped out. His expression carried the kind of fury that is born from exposure. He called my name loud enough that heads turned. He said I was being manipulated by bitter old women with nothing better to do. The words rang through the lobby. I tried to speak, but my throat closed. Then something inside me broke open. I said, louder than I meant to, "You left me on that road." The sound of my own voice startled me. The office went still. Even Brooke's hand froze mid-gesture. For the first time, Daniel had no reply. Security approached, unsure whom to protect. Lydia stepped forward, her tone calm but unyielding, explaining that Daniel's guardianship filing was fraudulent and that the investigation had already begun. Brooke stepped back, her eyes flickering between us and the curious faces gathering near the desks. I saw calculation shift into fear. Daniel tried to speak again, but Agnes cut him off, her voice soft as a blade. "Let her finish being your mother before you erase her entirely," she said. The sentence landed heavier than any shout. We left the building under a silence that was not defeat, but release. Outside, the wind off the lake carried the faint scent of rain. My legs shook, yet I felt lighter. Agnes guided me to a bench by the water. I told her I no longer recognized the man who had once asked me to read bedtime stories. She answered, "You are not supposed to recognize him. You are supposed to recognize yourself." Lydia's phone buzzed. Her contact at the firm confirmed that Brooke had been falsifying financial reports, diverting funds offshore under Daniel's signature. Agnes called it their first real crack in the glass. I stared at the water, the surface rippling under a pale sun. What I felt was not rage, but something colder and cleaner, Clarity. I whispered to myself, I will not beg to be believed. I will become undeniable. The wind caught the words and carried them across the lake like a vow made to the tide itself. Morning came slowly, as if the world itself was tired of watching people hurt one another. The house smelled of toasted bread and strong coffee. Agnes and Lydia spoke quietly at the kitchen table, reviewing updates from the night before Marie read messages from her phone, nodding in grim satisfaction. The investigation into Brooks' firm was already under review. There would be hearings, audits, and headlines. I sat apart from them, hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. Justice sounded like thunder in the distance, loud, cleansing, but still too far away to warm me. Agnes noticed my silence and joined me by the window. The harbor outside was silver and still. She said that Lydia had confirmed 2 options. I could press formal charges through the state's elder exploitation unit, which would destroy Daniel and Brooks' reputations, or I could reclaim my assets quietly through negotiation and withdraw the guardianship before it reached court. Agnes's tone was neutral, but her eyes searched mine. Justice and peace, she said, are not always the same thing. I did not answer. I could still see Daniel's face in that lobby, his fury, his fear, his confusion when I spoke the truth aloud. A mother can still recognize the child behind the man who betrayed her, and that is its own punishment. Later that day, I drove to Tacoma alone. The old house stood smaller than I remembered, its new owners tending roses where Mark's vegetable garden once grew. They recognized my name and invited me in with polite surprise. The rooms were brighter, freshly painted, but the air still carried a trace of cedar and turpentine from my years there. On the hallway table lay an envelope addressed to me. The woman said it had arrived weeks earlier by mistake. Inside was Mark's handwriting, careful and familiar. The letter had yellowed slightly, the ink fading at the edges. He had written to Daniel before his final surgery, urging him to take care of your mother, not her money. My breath caught. I imagined Mark's hands folding the page, trusting our son to understand. The letter was a bridge between 2 men I had loved, one gone too soon, the other lost by choice. When I returned to Port Madison, Agnes waited on the porch. I handed her the letter. She read it slowly, then placed it on the table between us. So, she said softly, which do you choose, the wound or the scar? The sea wind carried her words like prayer and judgment. Both. I looked toward the water where the tide was turning, pulling the small harbor boats with it. The scar, I said. It means I healed, not them. Agnes nodded, the faintest smile breaking through her calm. That evening, Lydia began the paperwork to revoke the guardianship and reclaim my property through quiet restitution. We would not seek criminal punishment, at least not yet power, I realized, did not always roar. Sometimes it simply refused to be erased. In my room, I wrote Daniel a letter. I told him I knew everything. I told him that I forgave nothing, but that I would not mirror his cruelty. I copied Mark's words at the end. Take care of your mother, not her money. Then I folded the page and placed it inside my sketchbook, between 2 blank sheets waiting for color. When the day slipped into evening, I painted again for the first time in months, a lighthouse standing against storm clouds, its beam cutting through gray water. Agnes watched from the doorway and said, "The tide is turning." I did not answer. I only painted the light brighter until it looked like it could reach the shore. If you're still watching and the emotions have pulled you in this far, comment number 6 below so I know you're standing strong with me. Now let's move into chapter 7, where every choice begins to show its consequence. Weeks passed before I realized how strange peace can feel when it finally returns. The morning mail arrived with an envelope from Lydia, stamped with the county seal, inside was a single page confirming that the guardianship claim had been withdrawn and that my legal autonomy was fully reinstated. My name stood alone, unshared, unqualified. I stared at it for a long time, tracing each letter as if they were brushstrokes in a painting I had almost lost. Relief did not rush in. It crept, careful and quiet. Justice is slow, and when it comes, it rarely feels like triumph. Brooke's firm was under public audit, her records pulled apart by the hands she could not charm. Lydia said I could testify and help secure a conviction, but I chose silence. The law would do its work without my voice adding another wound. I did not want to see Daniel's face in a courtroom. My goal had been to reclaim myself, not destroy what little remained of him. Still, the thought of him lingered, a bruise beneath the surface. Marie told me Daniel had resigned from his company. Brooke had left Seattle for Arizona. No one knew if they were still together. I heard this without reaction, as though she were describing strangers. Yet at night, I caught myself replaying old voicemails. His voice asking if I needed milk, if I wanted to come for dinner, if I had remembered my doctor's appointment. Ordinary kindness, spoken before everything shifted. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table and deleted them all. The final click echoed through the room like the closing of a door. My hands trembled, but when it was done, the air felt clearer. Agnes invited me to a Harbor Lantern meeting the following week. The gathering took place in the basement of a small church overlooking the bay. The room smelled of wax and coffee. Candles lined the windowsills, their light trembling against the walls. There were 10 women there, each carrying her own story of loss, homes taken, savings erased, families fractured. They spoke without bitterness, their words shaped by endurance rather than anger. When it was my turn, I told them about the rain, the road, the silence that followed. They listened without interruption. No one needed to ask how it felt to be left behind. Later, I began helping Lydia organize art sessions for women beginning their recovery. We painted together, hands, light, fragments of sea glass turned into color. I called the series The Frame Reclaimed. Each piece carried something broken made whole again. Agnes said it was the art of quiet justice. She was right. The work did not erase my pain. It gave it form, something I could hold without fear. One evening, as I walked home from the market, I saw him. Daniel stood across the street under a streetlight, his shoulders slightly bent, a paper bag in one hand. The years between us were visible now, creases on his face, the weary slump of a man who had looked too long at his own mistakes. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. He did not move toward me, and I did not step closer. There was no anger left, only understanding that the distance between us could not be crossed by words. He turned away first. I let him go. Forgiveness, I realized, is not forgetting. It is remembering without asking for permission to heal. That night, Agnes and I walked along the pier. The tide was rising, the lanterns floating out again, their reflections swaying in the dark water. Agnes said, "Every tide leaves something behind." I answered, "And sometimes it leaves us standing." The wind lifted my hair, and for the first time in years, I saw my reflection not as what was taken, but as what remained, whole, steady, and unbroken. The rhythm of my days changed quietly, like the sea trading tides. I moved into a small cottage near the harbor, the kind of place where morning light slips through linen curtains and gulls announce the start of the day. I learned to wake without alarms or appointments, to make my own coffee and watch the water shift color with the weather. Freedom was not loud. It was the slow unlearning of fear. Each morning I walked along the shore, the sand cool beneath my shoes, the salt wind brushing against the ache that still lives somewhere inside me. My garden was modest, a few herbs, wildflowers, and a stubborn rose bush that refused to bloom evenly. I loved its imperfections. They reminded me that growth rarely looks graceful. After years of being managed, signed for, and spoken over, even buying groceries felt like a declaration. The clerk at the small market knew my name now. She smiled when I paid in cash and said she liked the paint stains on my fingers. I realized then that independence does not arrive in one moment. It collects quietly through hundreds of small decisions that belong only to you. Harbor Lantern had grown into something larger than any of us expected. Lydia handled the logistics, Agnes mentored the newcomers, and I began leading art sessions twice a month. We called them Art as Evidence. Each canvas became a record of a woman's endurance, vivid, scarred, unashamed. Watching others discover color again felt like witnessing light entering rooms long closed. Agnes often stood by the doorway, her eyes soft with pride. She said the sessions reminded her that healing is not about what is returned, but about what you reclaim. One afternoon, I received a letter from the state's financial recovery office. My remaining accounts had been restored, along with a small velvet box that had been held as evidence. Inside lay Mark's pocket watch, the one Daniel had pawned months ago. I took it to a repair shop, and the craftsman polished it until the metal glowed faintly like dusk. When it ticked again, steady and quiet, I felt time itself exhale. Weeks later, Daniel appeared at my door. He looked thinner, his hair touched with gray. He held an envelope but did not step inside. He said only that he wanted to return what was mine. Inside were old photographs, me, Mark, and Daniel as a boy, standing beside a lake. He said he did not expect forgiveness, only hoped I could live without fear. I thanked him and closed the door gently. Through the window, I watched him walk away, not as a son lost, but as a chapter finished. The silence he left behind did not wound, it cleared space. That evening, I wrote a letter to myself, to the woman I used to be. I told her she had survived, but more than that, she had chosen to live. I folded the note beside Mark's watch. The sound of its ticking filled the room, a heartbeat reclaimed. At dawn, I sat by the water and began to paint again. A woman in a wheelchair facing the horizon, the sea glittering with light. Agnes came and said, "Pretend I am your mother." I smiled and whispered, "I think I have finally become her." If the strength and silence in this story have reached you, comment number 8 below to let me know you're still here. The ending is near. Stay for the final chapters to see what peace really costs. Autumn arrived with its quiet gold, the air crisp and forgiving. Leaves drifted across the harbor like slow-moving embers. I had learned to love this kind of stillness, the way a season changes without asking permission, the way it reminds you that time will move whether or not you are ready. My days had fallen into a rhythm again. I painted, walked, and kept the watch Mark once carried on my desk. It ticked steadily, no longer a reminder of loss, but of continuity. When Lydia told me that the gallery downtown wanted to feature my work, I laughed at first. The idea of strangers standing before pieces born from grief felt almost intrusive, but Agnes insisted that stories need air, or they turn to dust. So, I agreed. On the evening of the exhibition, the small gallery glowed with lamplight and murmured voices. Paintings from the frame reclaimed hung along the walls, women's hands, lighthouses, fragments of shoreline rebuilt from color and patience. Each stroke carried a piece of my history, yet none of them belonged only to me anymore. Harbor Lantern gathered there too, each woman radiant in her own survival. Lydia stood beside the table of wine glasses, her eyes proud but restrained. Agnes leaned on her cane, her hair pinned with silver clips that caught the light. She whispered that the show was not about art, but about proof. that beauty can live even after cruelty. I nodded, too moved to speak. When I looked around, I realized that every face in the room was a witness to endurance. Later that night, Lydia approached me with a quiet look. She said one of my paintings had sold to an anonymous buyer who had also donated to Harbor Lantern. The name on the transfer was Daniel's. I did not react at first. My heart neither quickened nor broke. There was simply a long, steady exhale. He had chosen to give something back, perhaps as apology, perhaps as closure. I would never know. What mattered was that the story had turned its own final page without my hand guiding it. A week later, Agnes hosted a dinner for the women of Harbor Lantern. The table was lined with candles and laughter that rose like soft music. When she asked for a toast, I raised my glass to those who choose light when darkness feels easier. The women answered with a murmur of agreement. Then Agnes asked each of us to speak one word to define our present. Some said hope, others said courage. When it came to me, I said steady. It felt right. A word that held neither triumph nor regret, only peace. That night, rain brushed against the window of my cottage. I sat beside it and thought of motherhood, not as obligation, but as guidance, a love that does not require possession. I realized that I no longer needed Daniel's forgiveness, nor did I owe him mine. Letting go was its own form of grace. I began a new painting, a lighthouse at dawn. Two figures walking side by side along the pier. You could not tell who was leading. Peace, I thought, is not something you win. It is what you stop fighting. The last of winter melted quietly, leaving the shoreline damp and shining. Each morning, the harbor loosened from its gray grip, and gulls returned to circle above the tide. I walked along the path that curved by the water, the air cool and new. It was not the world that had changed, but the way I moved through it. My body still ached some mornings. My hands still trembled when I painted too long, but there was no fear in the shaking. It was only proof that I remained alive. At my desk, sunlight touched the corner where 3 letters rested. Mark's note to Daniel, my letter to the woman I used to be, and an empty sheet waiting to be filled. I read the first 2 again. Mark's handwriting urged care, not control. My own words spoke of survival without apology. Then I began the 3rd letter, addressed simply, to whoever finds this after me. I wrote that time does not take everything. It gives wisdom back in slower form. I wrote that you are never too late to be your own rescuer. I folded the page and placed it with the others, a quiet inheritance for someone I would never meet. Later, Agnes invited me to the pier. The women of Harbor Lantern were gathering for the anniversary of our first meeting. We carried paper lanterns painted with words that had once frightened us: freedom, faith, forgiven, home. When my turn came, I wrote "Still Here" across mine and lit the candle inside. As we released them, the lanterns drifted out like small suns on the water, their reflections trembling in the waves. The night smelled of salt and ash, both cleansing and real. Watching the light fade, I understood what I had been chasing all this time. Revenge had once seemed sharp enough to cut through shame, but mercy required a steadier hand. I did not win by punishment. I endured by remaining whole. Daniel's regret, if it existed, was no longer my burden to measure. I had outgrown the story that tried to end me. When dawn came, Agnes poured tea from a small thermos. We sat wrapped in blankets, the air silver with mist. She said, "You kept your promise. You made him regret everything without lifting a single weapon." I smiled. "He was never the lesson," I said. I was. The words felt light, like something finally returned to its rightful place. After she left, I walked alone along the pier. The sea moved softly beneath the boards, carrying the last of the lanterns toward open water. I touched the pocket watch in my coat, its ticking gentle as breath. The sky lightened to rose. Every ending, I whispered to the horizon, is just a gentler beginning. The wind carried it away, leaving only the sound of waves finding their rhythm again. In the quiet that follows every storm, there is a lesson hidden in the stillness. Life rarely returns what it takes, yet it offers something quieter. Understanding? Time teaches that peace is not about forgetting what hurt us, but learning to live so fully that the pain no longer leads the way. Forgiveness is not surrender. It is the reclaiming of power over our own hearts. Every betrayal, every silence, every loss carves space for truth to settle. What endures is not vengeance or sorrow, but the courage to begin again with gentleness. We are all, in some way, rebuilding, learning to stand after being broken, learning to see light where trust once lived. The tide always returns, and with it, the chance to start anew. Thank you for watching. If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts below, and stay with us by liking, subscribing, and following for more stories that linger long after the last word.